Hello all. Welcome to another Today we have Darren, a developer advocate at AWS. Today he'll be talking about how to build beautiful production-ready apps with AWS Amplify. Derek, over to you.
Thanks, Amandeep. So, welcome to the stream. As Amandeep said, today I'm going to take you through 30 minutes of how to build production ready apps on Amplify. I'm going to do this by going through and creating a real scenario, so a real application, and explain personas that I see building apps using Amplify. So hopefully you'll learn something today in this next 30 minutes. So let's kick off. First of all, who am I? So my name's Derek. As Amandeep said, I'm a developer advocate at AWS, and I have spent the last 20 years building software. I've built software at front end, back end, and everything in between. And for the last 10 years, I've probably been doing cloud native development on lots of different application stacks. And for the last 4 years, I've been working at AWS. So at AWS at the minute, I am a developer advocate. Originally from Ireland, I now live in Perth, which is in Western Australia. You can reach out to me at LinkedIn there or on Twitter as well. So I want to start this talk by talking about the personas that we see when we are developing software. So there's three key personas that I see when developing software. We have the UX designer, the developer, and DevOps or SRE engineer. So designer obviously designs the look and feel and how an application works. Developer writes the code. And then DevOps or SRE engineer builds a pipeline, automation, and helps grow that product when it goes live and users start using it and they want new features. So they're the three personas that we see when we're building software development. The problem with these personas is they all use different tools. So a UX designer would use a different tool set than a developer, who would then use a different tool set and produce different artifacts than a DevOps, SRE, site reliability, an SRE engineer. So the problem there is that if we're all using different tools and different artifacts and different products, it slows down how we build software because we're always trying to interact and work out how to best read each other's products. So that's where AWS Amplify can help. So Amplify itself, if you haven't come across it before, it's a tool set, a set of libraries, and that helps front end and mobile engineers really accelerate their application development. So I'm just going to go and do a quick refresher. So I see Amplify as three distinct stages. You have the Amplify CLI, that you use to provision backends for your application. So backend could be an API, could be a data store, it could be recognition, so AI/ML sort of capabilities. So that they're all provisioned using the CLI. We also have AWS Amplify Studio, which is a visual representation of everything that we can provision as well. So you don't have to use the CLI to provision everything for your application backend. You can use Amplify Studio. And then we have the Amplify client libraries. So I see the client libraries as a way of interacting between the front end that I've built and the back end that I've provisioned. Now the front end I can build in any front-end framework that I so desire. So if I want to use React, I can. If I want to use Angular, I can. If I want to use Flutter, I can. And all of these front-end frameworks all have Amplify client libraries. And all of these live on GitHub. So they're all open sourced And so you, as a developer, and we can go in and create issues, create PRs, and really join in that open source community that sits around Amplify. So that's the first part of Amplify. The second part is all around what you can add to Amplify. So it works as a way of abstracting all the complexities of backend services from the developer. So a backend service could be, as I said before, an API and a data store, or it could be some what's another good one? Storage. So you could have some storage for your application. And traditionally, if you're building an application and using AWS on that back end, you would have to intimately know what S3 commands you needed, or how you were going to store your objects for your application. Now with Amplify, you're abstracting that complexity away, and we just do that using the storage feature category. So you don't actually need to know how S3 behaves. You just use the Amplify Storage API, and it then communicates with the underlying data store on AWS, which is usually S3. So that's their feature categories, and we've got quite a few of those, ranging from authentication, which will abstract away that authentication and authorization feature for your app, to geo functionalities. So you can do geocoding, route calculation, and all of that, and that's abstracted using the Amplify feature category. And these feature categories and the Amplify toolset fits in really well with how modern applications are built. So we usually see three phases where you build the application. So you add the fundamental building blocks, where you add the scaffolding, you choose whatever frameworks you're going to use, you add authentication, and then connect those features into the back end. So very similar to all of the things that Amplify can do for you. And then once you finish building, of course, then you think about, well, how am I going to ship this application into the hands of users? So then we talk about the ship phase and how we can automate a build and deployment pipeline, and get that working with our front end and our back end and out into users. And then we talk about the scale part, and that's all about adding more complex features like AI, ML, or geolocation, or listening to our users and making sure that our application is scaling to meet our user needs, but still having the full access to the code base if we want to extend our application beyond what maybe a traditional framework would do. So these really tie in nicely with the Amplify capabilities: build, ship, and scale. So I'm going to start with talking about the build and ship personas, because I see the UX designer and the developer really being the key personas that do the build and ship. I'm going to describe that as a typical development workflow. If you think about how we, as developers, interact with UX designers. So what typically happens is a UX designer would have a wireframe diagram that would describe the application that we're building, lay out the components and show it to the developer. And usually these wireframe components would ship. I've seen them as pictures, PNG files. I've seen them as, if they're using something like Photoshop, you can ship the Photoshop file, and all different ways of that, as we talked about earlier, different tools and products that a UI designer uses compared to a developer. And then developer, when we get the designs, we then have to think about, well, how am I going to start creating those components in code? How am I going to bind the UI to the underlying data layer, so the underlying persistence of the code? And then how am I going to write custom logic to see how the application behaves how the designer wants it to? So that's quite a lot of code. And there's quite a lot of back and forth between a developer and a UX designer to get that working. And if you've developed lots of applications, you'll know that as a developer and a designer start talking, we lose a lot of the original ideas around the design because it gets lost in that communication. So to try and solve that, well, what typically happens? Well, we have two options that we see out there. Either the designer takes full control over the design and build phase and actually runs it from end to end, or the developer takes control and takes charge end to end and becomes that overseer of that process. Now, which one of these work? You probably worked in an organization where both of these has been used. Well, neither really work because that communication between designer and developer is still always a problem, and we've got nothing that fixes the underlying problem of they're all using different tool sets that don't communicate with each other. So that's why last year Amplify released a new feature, which was how to integrate Figma, which is an online design tool that a lot of UX designers use. It's a lot more powerful than traditional design tools because you can just publish a Figma component as a URL in a browser and share that amongst all the developers. So that works really well. So we've integrated that into Amplify Studio. So Amplify Studio, I explained it slightly earlier, is a nice single pane of glass over your application backend, so you can see visually what your application backend is. So we released that at reInvent last year. So I'm not going to talk about it. I'm actually going to show you how I built an application using these technologies. So I'm going to build an application that rates drinks that I have. So if I go out to a restaurant or go out to a cafe and I have a drink, I like to rate it. So I like to build an application that actually stores these ratings. So when I go back to that cafe again, I know what drink to order. So that's what I'm going to build today. So here's the application itself. It's called Rate My Drink. It's a very simple application. It is called Rate My Drink. As I told you, you enter the drink name. So if you have the first drink you have, could be anything, coffee, you give it a score out of 5 for stars, and you add it to the list of drinks. And then you can add multiple drinks. So here, this little demo, I'm adding 2. Give a different number of stars, hit add, and it'll show you the list of drinks that you've had. Now it gives you name and rating, but I also want to see a picture of the drink, so take my phone out, take a picture. So this is the code for Rate My Drink. It's a typical React app, actually. It's got an entry point of app.js, and I haven't changed the function name, but it's called app. And it uses an Amplify feature category called data store. So that's going to provision an API and a persisting data store. The UI is a nav bar and a couple of cards. So it's an add item card. It's a table card to display the list. And if we look in there, we'll see the add item cards, nothing fancy. Now there's a table card. So it's just a list with some actions into those components. So now if I do an Amplify status, so Amplify status is a CLI command that will show you what current backend resources you've got provisioned for this application. So I have an API. So data store feature category, provision me an API. And this is how I communicate with my backend. Then if I do Amplify console, I can go and see that backend by using Amplify Studio. So it will give me the URL that I need to open. So if I hit that, this is my Amplify Studio view of my backend. In here, I've got the data that I've just created, so that's persisted very nicely. I can create another drink here. So you'll see 2 of these fields are red, and that's telling me that these fields have been modeled to be mandatory. So I can create another drink here, but I can also go and see the underlying data model. So the underlying data model for this application has a name, which is mandatory, and a rating, which is mandatory, and the other two, image and price, are not mandatory. I can then go and start thinking about my UI. So here's where I open up Figma. So I can open up Figma inside Amplify Studio. I open up a default template. So we've built and created a Amplify UI template for Figma. and I'm going to reuse that. So I got components in this template that I can change and primitives that I can't. So, and I'm just showing you these primitives. So if I choose one of the cards that may work nicely with my design, I choose one of the cards and I can go into Figma and actually change the look and feel of this card. So say I'm a UI designer, so that's the persona I am at the minute. I can go into my UI and change the cards, how they look, so it fits the view of the application that I want to build. And so that's what I'm doing now. I'm just removing all of the stuff that I don't want into my UI. I think it'll clutter it a bit. So just fixing that up. Now, because I'm using Figma, I can import that component straight into Amplify. And what it'll do, it'll pull these components in and generate them inside Amplify. So I can then configure the underlying data model, so the link between data and UI. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm giving each component linked into my data model. So the first one is obviously image. So I'm linking the source of the image prop into the data model image column. And then I'm doing the same for title, and I'll do the same for rating, so that when this component displays, it reads the data. So I can also generate lots of data. So here I'm using the auto generation tool, and I can do constraints. So if I generate data, I can give it a constraint between 1 and 5 for rating. So I just do that to create myself some dummy data. And I'm doing this because another cool feature of this is I can shuffle preview data. So all of that data I've created, I can just shuffle through it and see how it looks inside the component that I'm creating, which is a very cool feature. Then once I'm happy with that, I create a collection. So I want lots of drinks, remember, in my application. So it needs to be inside a collection. So again, I can use Amplify Studio, and I can be the designer here, not the developer, the designer, making sure that the component that I want the app to display looks exactly like I need to. And so that gives me a lot of flexibility inside the studio itself. And I can tinker with the padding and the flow and the direction of the list. And then once I'm happy with that, I can then import that component into my application, into my React application. So if I can do that by going Amplify pull. And what that does, it actually generates the JavaScript code for the components. So the component I've created all in Amplify Studio in Figma is now being generated, has now had the code generated for it. So I didn't have to write a thing. I didn't have to write any of the data model bindings either, all done for me. And so the final thing I need to do to finish this application off, this stage of it off, is just remove all of the code I've written previously for table card and replace it with the component that I've just created in Amplify Studio, which is called drink collection. So I save that and rerun my application. And hopefully now you will see that the look and feel in the UI of the application is a lot better than when I initially just created a scaffold. And this is really reflecting the UI designer's look and feel and what the UI designer wanted to get out of the application. I can also, as a developer, so I'm a developer persona now, I can also change some of the properties on these components. So after looking at the list, I've decided that it needs some pagination. So I'm adding in some pagination, probably 2 items per page. And so I can do that inside the code. So that again gives me that flexibility to change the look and feel and the behavior of this application, which is very, very, very powerful and very, very flexible. So that shows you how a UI designer and a developer can work seamlessly together, because we were using Amplify Studio as a way of communicating the design and the code. And we can iterate through this a number of times and until we're both happy that the application is exactly what we need. So a quick recap of what I did there. So I started off by editing components in Figma. So as I put on my UX designer persona, and I started in Figma, and I started to look at components from my application to make it look and feel lovely. I then imported those components into Amplify, and I continued to change them to connect them to the underlying data model. And then once I was happy with that, and I generated some dummy data and then shuffle through how that would look in my component, I then went and imported that code into my application, and that generated code for my React application that could just be used inside the application to display the drinks that I wanted. So I turned what was a terrible list into quite a pretty list that the UX designer was happy with. So developer, UX designer working really well together to create a lovely final product using Amplify. So that's the UX designer component done. The next one I wanted to talk about was the developer and DevOps persona. So we talk about that when we've got we've finished our application, so that the MVP of the application is ready. Developer, designer, they're happy with it. The next stage is to ship that application to the hands of users and then maintain it. So shipping usually means that you build a build and deployment pipeline that automates that deployment, and then you also build a feedback mechanism into that so that you can then start enhancing your application. So that's what typically these personas do. Now, if you've used Amplify before, you'll know that there's some constraints around the things that you can change. So because it's very opinionated, it accelerates your application development story by being opinionated. But we're getting feedback from customers going, well, it's too opinionated. What if I want to do X and Amplify only supports Y? Well, now we can help with that as well using Amplify, which really helps the developer DevOps personas. So we can extend Amplify. So what we can do, we can use CDK to override and add and export resources from Amplify and make sure that these Amplify resources are extensible. And as developers, we can really do what we want with the application. So you can override provision services. You can really change services to suit your needs. So there's three real use cases to this. The first one is where you want to modify an existing Amplify feature. So you've built an Amplify app. You may use you want to change, in the use case here, is change the default temporary password validity for Amazon Cognito. So Amazon Cognito, if you don't know, is the service that's wrapped by the authentication feature category in Amplify. Now, Amplify hides all that complexity away from you. But what if you want to go into Cognito and change the default password validity? Well, now you can with Amplify Override. So in the Amplify CLI, you can go Amplify Override, and it will generate a CDK project, which you can then go into and change the anything about the Cognito user pool that's generated. The second use case that we've changed is the ability to add any of the over 200 services that AWS provides into an Amplify project. So this really satisfies a use case like if an SRE wants to add SNS to the back end of an application, you can now do that with the Amplify add command. So if SNS is currently not one of the supported Amplify feature categories, so by using the Amplify add command, you can actually add that in to the Amplify project, even though it's not one of the feature categories. So that's a really powerful feature, and it gives you, again, as a developer, extreme extensibility of an Amplify project. And then finally, the most requested feature around Amplify was the ability to add an Amplify project to an existing build and deployment pipeline. Amplify itself creates a lot of CloudFormation when you add a feature category to the project. And so what we needed is a way to bring that Amplify project into an existing pipeline. Now we can do that now with using Amplify Export. So Amplify Export exports the Amplify project as a CDK project And so if you've got an existing build and deployment pipeline, so traditionally we're seeing enterprises and large organizations that have built out a very sophisticated build and deployment pipeline, but they really want to use Amplify for some of the application's features. And so they can do that now by using Amplify Export, and then the CDK project that's exported from Amplify, they run inside their existing build and deployment pipeline, which is very cool. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So this is how you do that. So here we are. I'm now back inside my Amplify project, and I've built a CDK pipeline. So if you haven't used CDK before, you'll see this is the entry point to the CDK project, and it is a pipeline. And with pipelines, you need to pass in all of the config. So I've built up a config.json that will allow me to inject any configurations I have, like pipeline name, repository of the source, what environments I want to deploy to, what accounts I want to deploy to, and what regions I want to deploy to. So this is typical of a CDK pipeline. Then inside the stack itself, so CDK is arranged in stacks. Inside the stack itself, I then define this pipeline. So I define the source code, so where the source code sits. So this particular pipeline has its source code in GitHub. So it will deploy the source and build the source that's in GitHub. And I set that up. And then I set up different stages of this pipeline. So pre-prod and prod. So pre-prod goes to a particular region and prod goes to a different region. So this is the flexibility that the pipelines allow, where you can deploy across accounts, across regions, which you couldn't do with Amplify projects until this change. So now, if I look at the actual what this pipeline will deploy inside here, so you can see that currently it's deploying a few things. So it's deploying an SNS topic. It's adding a subscription, and it's notifying people when that subscription is fired. And so these are all services that currently don't exist within Amplify. And this is the pipeline inside Code Pipeline. So this is what it looks like inside the console. It's got a source stage from GitHub, if you remember. It's got a build stage. It's got update pipeline stage, where it actually updates itself. And then it's got the asset stage where it builds the code assets, and then the deployment stages of dev and prod. So with pipelines, you can also add transitions. So you can go manual approvals or test stages. So all of that, that's the pipeline that this is currently exists. So this could be an existing enterprise pipeline that you wanted to add an Amplify project to. So let's go back to our Amplify project, and you can see this is our drink application. So if I now go Amplify Export, or sorry, Amplify Status, you'll see that it is indeed still has the same API. It's still the rate drink application. So the next stage I need to do is Amplify Export. So Amplify Export will then create a CDK project with the assets from this project. So this is the asset, so it's going to export an API, and it will create a new folder structure, all with this exported data. And it also tells you how to import that project into a CDK app, which is pretty handy. So here is the exported project itself. So there's the API and all of the different properties inside the application, and the GraphQL schema, because the API itself is a GraphQL API. You can look inside that if you want to and see that that is indeed the back end of this application. So once that's exported, we then we need to go back to our CDK app and import it. So we copy the instructions, we go back to our CDK pipeline, we execute the instructions. So First, what we're doing here is importing the dependencies for a CDK Amplify exported backend. So once that's imported, I'll then import it in code at the top. So this will then allow me to reference this exported Amplify project and inside my CDK project. Once I've imported it, I can then actually call it. So here I'm going, this is the new Amplify exported backend. The location of this, it's called rate drink or rate beer. The path to the exported files, and then you define the stage. So I only want the Amplify project to be deployed in dev, so I can give it a test before sticking it into prod. So that's how you do it. 3 lines of code, you can bring that Amplify application in and use it in an existing CDK pipeline, which is very cool. So the final recap. So what have we done? So we started off by editing UI components in Figma. So as a UX designer persona, I have an idea of how my application wants to look. And so I go into Figma and I edit those UIs. I then sync that UI with Amplify Studio. So I go into Amplify Studio, use the Figma URL for the component. I look at it, I generate data for it, I make sure it looks and behaves correctly, and then I import it into my application as React code. Then I can build an application backend using Amplify, the Amplify API feature category, which creates me a GraphQL API database. Then I can extend any feature in the application that I want using the new extend, add, and override commands in the Amplify CLI. And then finally, I can export this Amplify project and import it into an existing CDK pipeline. And so I can then deploy it through an existing pipeline. So what this does, it leverages these personas can still use the tools that they want, but it gives us a beautiful way of communicating between each component, because we are using that common flow of Figma to Amplify Studio, generate the code, and then the code can go into, the project itself can go into any pipeline. If you're interested in what I've spoke about today, there's a few starters. The last one, sandbox.amplifyapp.com, you don't require an AWS account to get started, so you can go and start building out your data model for your application and get started with Amplify. Thanks for listening. My name is Derek. Again, there's my Twitter handle. If there's any questions, I'll take them. But thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks for the wonderful session, and hope to see you around soon.
Thanks, Amandeep. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Hey, Derek.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the broadcast has been ended. Do you still have a few minutes to talk?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
Uh, First of all, thank you for taking time out and for the wonderful session um, that you presented.
No
Um,
problem. My pleasure.
Thank you. I know it's getting late for you, uh, and I would try to limit this conversation to as short as I can.
No problem.
Yeah,
Yep. How
yeah,
is the
yeah.
user group going anyway? Are you getting a lot of engagement?
So I started this user group only during Corona time, and until this day, we didn't have a chance to conduct even a single in-person offline event. So um, a general feedback is that individuals have, they have actually gotten tired